Marco Rodriguez was a 32-year-old mechanic who earned just enough to pay the rent on a small apartment on the outskirts of Madrid. Every morning, before opening his modest shop, he would stop to bring breakfast to a homeless woman who slept under the portico of an abandoned church in the Vallecas neighborhood. A hot café con leche, a croissant, a few kind words. He had been doing this for 8 months, never asking for anything in return, not even knowing her name. She never spoke, she simply accepted gratefully, taking what he offered with trembling hands. Marco knew nothing about her. He didn't know where she came from or why she had ended up on the streets. He only knew that no one deserves to be invisible. Then, one November morning, 3 Spanish Air Force officers in dress uniform appeared at the door of his shop. Behind them were 2 black cars with tinted windows and an elegant woman with gray hair whom Marco had never seen. They said they were there for him, that he must come with them immediately. And when Marco asked why, the answer he received took his breath away. The homeless woman he brought breakfast to every morning was not who he thought she was. If you're ready for this story, write in the comments where you're watching this video from. Marco Rodriguez was 32 and had a life many would consider mediocre, but which he accepted with the serenity of someone who learned early that things don't always work out as one wishes and that you have to make do with what life gives you. He was born in a working-class neighborhood of Vallecas in southern Madrid, the son of a car mechanic and a cleaning woman, both of whom worked exhausting shifts to make ends meet and guarantee their only child a roof over his head and a hot meal on the table every night. His father had taught him everything he knew about cars, passing on not only the technical skills of the trade but also a philosophy of life that Marco would carry with him forever, engraved on his heart. He always said that a man is measured by how he treats those who can give him nothing in return, that true wealth is not in your wallet but in your heart, and that he who turns his back on the suffering does not deserve to be called a man or to look his own reflection in the eye. Those words were etched in Marco's mind, like an indelible mark that time could not erase, especially after his father died of a heart attack at 54, consumed by a life of hard, underpaid work that left him with no pension or savings for his final days. Marco had to leave high school at 17 to help his mother, who had fallen ill shortly after her husband's death and needed expensive care that the public healthcare system didn't fully cover. He had worked as an apprentice in several shops around the city, learning the trade with absolute dedication and infinite patience, until he finally managed to open his own small business in a rented unit in an industrial area of Villaverde, in southern Madrid. It wasn't much, just a warehouse with a roof that leaked when it rained hard and a faded sign that simply said Taller Rodriguez. But it was his, earned with his own calloused hands and his unwavering honesty, which had never betrayed a single customer. His mother had died 3 years earlier, leaving him alone in the world with no other close relatives to turn to. Marco had never married, had no children, and the few romantic relationships he'd had floundered against his inability to put anything ahead of his work and the people he had decided to help without expecting anything in return. He lived in a small rental apartment just a few blocks from the shop, a tiny, austere place where he slept a few hours each night before starting the next day's routine all over again. It was during one of those morning commutes, from his apartment to the shop, that Marco first saw the homeless woman who would change his life forever. It was a still cold March morning, even though winter was technically over, and she was huddled under the portico of an old, abandoned church that the city council had left in limbo years before while deciding what to do with it. She wore layers of dirty clothes and a gray blanket that didn't seem enough to protect her from the damp cold of the Castilian plateau. She had messy brown hair covering her face and shivered as she slept, like a wounded animal seeking shelter where it could find it. Marco had stopped to look at her for a long moment, feeling something tighten in his chest with an unexpected force. He had seen homeless people all his life, as anyone who lives in a major Spanish city has. But there was something about this woman that struck him differently, more deeply. Perhaps it was the way she hugged herself, seeking a warmth that never came. Perhaps it was her obvious vulnerability in that body curled against the brick wall of the old portico. Or perhaps it was simply that Marco remembered his father's words and decided he could not turn his back and pretend he hadn't seen anything. The next day, He had returned to the same spot with a hot café con leche and a croissant bought from the bar below his apartment. A simple gesture that cost him almost nothing, but meant everything to someone who had absolutely nothing in this world. From that first morning in March, Marco had not missed a single day of his silent appointment with the nameless woman. Torrential rain, biting cold, stifling Madrid summer heat, dense fog that covered the streets like a damp shroud. It didn't matter what the weather was like or how tired he was after a particularly hard day's work under his customers' cars. He always got up 20 minutes earlier than necessary to have time to stop by the abandoned church with breakfast for the woman who had, without either of them realizing it, become a fundamental part of his daily routine. At first, she had been distrustful, understandably cautious, as was natural for someone living on the streets who had probably learned from harsh experience not to trust anyone. For the first few days, she had accepted the food without looking up from the ground, taking the cup of hot coffee and the paper bag with the croissant with quick, nervous movements, as if afraid someone might snatch them away at any moment. She had never said a word, never looked Marco in the eye, not even for a fleeting instant. She never showed any sign of recognition beyond a slight nod of the head that could be interpreted as gratitude or simply as an automatic reflex of someone who had learned to survive by accepting what was offered without asking uncomfortable questions. But Marco had never expected anything in return for what he did for her. He didn't do it to receive verbal thanks or to feel like a good person when he looked in the mirror at night. He did it simply because it was the right thing to do, period, with no need for further explanation or justification to anyone. His father had taught him that true charity was the kind that sought no reward of any kind, the kind done in silence in the darkness of dawn, with no need for witnesses or applause from anyone who might see the gesture. As the weeks and then months passed, something gradually began to change in the behavior of the mysterious woman under the portico. Her movements became less nervous when she heard Marco's footsteps approaching on the sidewalk, her body less tense and coiled when he crouched beside her to leave the coffee and croissant on the cold stone step. She had begun to look up for a fleeting instant, and Marco had glimpsed her eyes for the first time. They were blue and intense, clear blue like the Castilian sky on clear spring days, a color that seemed completely out of place on that face marked by street life and the elements. And in them was a sharp, watchful intelligence that clearly contradicted the image of total abandonment that the rest of her unkempt appearance conveyed to anyone who looked at her. Marco had noticed other intriguing details that didn't fit at all with the stereotypical idea most people have of a homeless person. Her hands, though dirty and cracked from the cold, had nails that had clearly been well cared for until not too long ago. The way she moved, when she thought no one was watching, had a certain innate, natural elegance that suggested a refined upbringing received in environments very different from the one she found herself in now. And sometimes, when she believed Marco had already left and couldn't hear her, she would murmur something to herself in a low voice in a language he couldn't quite identify, but which definitely didn't sound like Spanish, perhaps German, or some other language from Northern Europe. Who was this mysterious woman really? Where did she originally come from? What had led her to live as a homeless person under a crumbling portico on the outskirts of Madrid, far from everything and everyone? Marco had asked himself these questions many times during the long, lonely nights in his small apartment, but he had never actively sought answers or tried to question her about her past. It was a gray, cold November morning, with that typical Castilian plateau fog that enveloped Madrid like a damp, sticky shroud. Marco had just finished delivering breakfast to the woman, who that day seemed particularly tired and ill, with a persistent cough that shook her fragile body every few minutes. He had also left her some cold medicine bought at the on-duty pharmacy the night before and, as he always did, told her that if she needed anything, she could come to the shop, which was only a 10-minute walk away. She had nodded as always, without speaking, but that morning there had been something different in her gaze that Marco couldn't interpret at the time. For the first time in 8 months, she had reached out a hand toward him and touched his arm in a gesture that could be interpreted as deep gratitude or perhaps as a silent farewell. Marco hadn't given that gesture much thought, figuring it was just a moment of weakness caused by the fever she clearly had. He had opened the shop as usual at 8 o'clock sharp, starting work on an old Seat Visa that needed a complete engine overhaul. He was so focused on his work that he hadn't heard the cars approaching through the industrial park. He hadn't noticed the uniformed figures stopping in front of the metal door of the warehouse. It was only when a shadow darkened the light coming through the open door that Marco looked up from the engine and saw 3 Spanish Air Force officers in dress uniform standing in the doorway, with serious, solemn expressions. Their faces were tense, almost grave, and behind them Marco could see 2 black cars with tinted windows parked in the industrial park's lot and an elegant woman with gray hair getting out of one of the vehicles with calm, assured movements. Marco's first thought was that he had done something wrong without knowing it, that he was in some kind of legal trouble he wasn't aware of. But the officers didn't have the air of policemen coming to arrest someone for a crime. They had the air of men who were about to communicate something important, something that was going to change everything forever. The tallest officer, a colonel judging by the stripes on his blue uniform, stepped forward and asked if he was Marco Rodriguez, owner of the taller Rodriguez in Villa Verde. Are you enjoying this story? Leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Now let's continue with the video. Marco nodded as he instinctively wiped his grease-stained hands on a dirty rag, feeling his heart beat faster and faster in his chest, not knowing exactly why. The colonel said they needed him to come with them immediately, that there was someone who wanted to meet him, someone very important who had waited a long time for this moment and couldn't wait another minute. Marco asked what this was all about, what was happening, why military personnel had come for him, a simple neighborhood mechanic, on an ordinary November morning. And it was then that the woman with the gray hair stepped forward firmly, and the answer she gave Marco left him completely breathless and speechless. The woman with the gray hair introduced herself as Elena Martinez, director of Spain's National Intelligence Center, the country's most important intelligence service. And what she told Marco in the hours that followed completely turned upside down everything he thought he knew about the homeless woman he had been bringing breakfast to every morning for the past 8 months at that decrepit portico in Vallecas. The woman who slept under the portico of the abandoned church was named Sophia Hoffman, and she was the widow of one of the richest and most influential men in all of Europe. Her husband, Klaus Hoffmann, had been a German industrialist from Munich with an economic empire spanning from aeronautics to the most advanced defense technology, with multi-million-dollar contracts with governments across half the world, including Spain, France, Italy, the United Kingdom, and the United States. When Klaus had died 3 years earlier in a plane crash in the Swiss Alps, an accident many suspected was not an accident at all, but a perfectly planned sabotage by professionals. Sophia had become the sole heir to a fortune estimated at over 8 billion euros in stocks, real estate, and bank accounts spread across the globe. But the inheritance was also a death sentence hanging over her head from the very day of her husband's funeral. Klaus's business partners, unscrupulous, immoral men with interests in activities not exactly legal, related to illicit arms trafficking to conflict zones and money laundering from international organized crime, wanted that fortune for themselves at any cost and were willing to do whatever was necessary to get it. They had tried to convince Sophia to hand over her shares in the Hoffman Group companies, first with kindness, offering her millions in exchange for her silence and cooperation, and then with increasingly explicit and violent threats against her life and the lives of anyone who dared to help or protect her, when she had flatly refused to give in to the blackmail and had threatened to reveal to international authorities and the press everything she knew about the illegal activities of her late husband's partners, including compromising documents that Klaus had kept as insurance. They had decided to eliminate her in the most discreet and efficient way possible, making it look like an accident or a voluntary disappearance. Sophia had escaped on a stormy night 3 years ago, leaving absolutely everything she owned in her mansion on the outskirts of Munich to save her life. She had lived on the run like a fugitive across half of Europe for endless months, constantly changing her identity every few weeks, hiding in places where no one in their right mind would ever look for her. She had passed through Austria, Switzerland, France, and Italy before ending up in Spain, choosing Madrid because it was a city large enough to get lost in and far enough from Germany to feel relatively safe. And she had chosen to live as a homeless person on the streets because it was the last place in the world her enemies would think to look for the widow of the great Klaus Hoffmann, Who would even imagine for a moment that a woman heir to 8 billion euros, a woman who had dined with presidents and prime ministers, was sleeping under a dirty portico in a working-class neighborhood on the outskirts of the Spanish capital, wrapped in a tattered blanket and eating from the charity of strangers? For 3 endless years, she had lived in the deepest shadows of society, completely alone, constantly terrified, waiting each day for the moment her enemies would finally find her or the day someone would at last come to save her from that nightmare that seemed to have no end. She had lost hope long before she met Marco. She had stopped believing that genuinely good people still existed in the world, people who helped others without expecting anything in return beyond the satisfaction of having done the right thing. And then Marco had come into her life like an unexpected angel, sent by some higher force. A poor neighborhood mechanic who had stopped one cold March morning to bring her a simple café con leche and a croissant, asking absolutely nothing in return, not asking uncomfortable questions about her past, not expecting gratitude or recognition of any kind for his daily kindness. Marco was taken to a guarded estate on the outskirts of Toledo, where Sophia Hoffman was waiting for him in a bright room overlooking olive fields that stretched to the horizon under the November sun. The woman he saw before him was almost unrecognizable compared to the homeless woman he had known for 8 long months on the streets of Vallecas. Her hair was washed and elegantly styled. She wore clean, expensive designer clothes, and her face, free of street grime, revealed a mature beauty that the years of suffering had not managed to erase completely. But the eyes were the same. Those intense, intelligent blue eyes that Marco had glimpsed so many times under the portico of the abandoned church now looked at him with an emotion that took his breath away and needed no words to be understood. Sophia spoke for the first time with her real voice, not the hoarse murmur of the street woman, but a cultured voice with a slight German accent that betrayed her Central European origins. She told Marco her story with details he hadn't heard from Elena Martinez, personal details that concerned not only the flight and constant fear but also the moments of absolute despair when she had thought of giving up, of letting herself die of cold on a winter night instead of continuing to live like a cornered animal fleeing its hunters. And she told how Marco had changed everything with his small daily gestures, how his simple daily act. That café con leche and that croissant delivered with a genuine smile and no ulterior motives, had become the only thing that gave her the strength to get up each morning and keep fighting to survive one more day. How she had begun to await dawn not with terror as before, but with hope, knowing that soon the only human being in all of Madrid who treated her as a person worthy of respect, and not as a social problem to be ignored on the sidewalk, would arrive. Marco listened silently to everything she had to tell him, overwhelmed by emotions he didn't know how to manage or express in words. He had never imagined that his small gestures could have such a great impact on another person's life. He had never thought he was anything more than a neighborhood mechanic trying to do the right thing each day without expecting applause or recognition. When Sophia finished speaking, the silence stretched for a long moment as they both searched for the right words to express what they felt in that unrepeatable instant. It was Sophia who broke the silence, telling him she wanted to do something for him to thank him for everything he had done, that she had the means to change his life completely, to give him everything he had ever wanted and much more. But Marco slowly shook his head, without hesitating for a second. He said he hadn't done what he did expecting a material reward, that he didn't want money, or gifts, or anything that could turn his kindness into a cold, calculated commercial transaction. He had helped a person in difficulty because that was what his father had taught him to do since he was a boy, and that was the only reward he needed and had ever sought.